According to the United States Department of Justice, improvements in communication technology, things like cell phones and computers, have made it easier to stay in touch with people and to find people, and that has reduced by nearly 40% the number of people who go missing in the United States each year over recent decades. And yet still a surprising number of people simply disappear. In 2021, for example, more than 36,000 people were reported missing in the United States and never found, according to a department database, leaving their families to forever wonder. It's a terrifying idea that someone, maybe someone you love, could simply go missing. Like Congressman John Creeley. An interesting story of party politics, a contested election, a financial scandal. A U.S. congressman simply disappeared without a trace. Not a lot is known about the early life of John Vautrin Creeley. He was born in Philadelphia on November 14, 1839. His parents were John S. Creeley and Elmida Vautrin Creeley. His maternal grandfather was a prominent Philadelphia merchant. He had a sister, Adelaide, who was just 9 months older, and there likely would have been some scandal seen as his parents were married just a month before Adelaide's birth. John S. passed away at the age of 36 in 1849 when John Vautrin was just 10 years old. His congressional biography says that he received a thorough classical education, and he is listed as having graduated from Philadelphia's Central High School in January of 1858. He studied law and was listed as having been admitted to the bar in 1862. Meanwhile, of course, war had started. The Pittsburgh Press reported that a little over a month after the inauguration of President Lincoln, the Keystone Artillery was organized in Philadelphia by Captain Matthew Hastings. When the battery was organized on April 21, 1861, 21-year-old John V. Creeley was listed as first sergeant. The battery was attached to the Pennsylvania Home Guard, but in July of 1862, the press writes, it was decided to establish a light battery of 6 guns that could be quickly moved to active service. The battery, now part of the regular army, was given the title of its old organization, Keystone Artillery. It was commanded by Hastings, and John V. Creeley was one of 4 first lieutenants. The battery saw quite a lot of action, including at Gettysburg, with Creeley continuing throughout the war. The battery was mustered out into the war, but with the intention of reorganizing it as part of the Pennsylvania National Guard, something which was accomplished in October of 1867. John V. Creeley was elected the captain of the new unit. The battery was used often in official ceremonies and celebrations, and Creeley's name is mentioned frequently in the Philadelphia papers. That notoriety likely helped him, along with his successful law practice. In 1867, Thomas Little resigned from the Philadelphia Common Council, and Creeley was elected to fill his term. Newspaper reports and council proceedings show him to have been an active member of the council. He continued to serve, representing the 7th Ward, until a new opportunity arose in 1870. Pennsylvania's 2nd Congressional District represented the city of Philadelphia, including Creeley's 7th Ward. The district was represented by 4-term Republican Representative Charles O'Neill, but O'Neill had run afoul of the powerful and connected Pennsylvania Senator Simon Cameron, and this gave Creeley a chance. The Vicksburg Herald wrote that Creeley was the creation of Simon Cameron, who had quarreled with Charles O'Neill, Creeley's predecessor, and set up Creeley to beat him. The election was anything but normal. There were no primaries then, just nominations by a party convention, but when the party convention met on June 15th, the delegates were almost evenly split between O'Neill supporters and anti-O'Neills, so evenly that they could not choose a chairman, and so the two groups met separately at opposite ends of the auditorium. One side nominated O'Neill, and the other side Creeley. It then became a fight for who would be the official Republican nominee. The Philadelphia Press wrote of the proceedings, the day has not been a most auspicious one for the Republican Party, largely characterized by the rowdyism and lawlessness heretofore confined to the Democratic conventions. O'Neill's friends were in the city. His faction at the convention had been chaired by the former mayor, and so he went to the Republican City Executive Committee, who named him the official nominee. But Creeley protested, arguing that as this was a congressional race, the decision should not be made by the city, but by the state Republican Central Committee, and he appealed there. O'Neill had less power there and feared Cameron's influence, and so when they called another convention, he simply had his delegates refuse to come, denying a quorum. Outraged, Creeley declared that he had been defrauded. He mounted his own campaign as an independent Republican. The Democrats might have been able to take advantage of the split, but their best candidate declined to run, and so they didn't nominate a candidate in the 2nd District. It was a race between O'Neill and Creeley. The election was close, but also contentious. An argument over a ward was contested, and in the course of the argument, a mob formed, and the Inquirer writes, Shay Nolan, a Democratic politician, was fatally shot by a police lieutenant. The shooting was ruled an act of self-defense, but the election had yielded a casualty. In the final count, Creeley won 11,059 votes against O'Neill's 10,134. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote, Mr. O'Neill has made an efficient congressional representative, but he has been compelled to succumb to disaffection in his own party. The Philadelphia Times reported that Mr. O'Neill was supported by many prominent Republicans throughout the city. The Democrats made no nomination, throwing their main strength to Mr. Creeley, and this bringing about the election. The powerful senator had chastened the four-term congressman, but Creeley had gotten his election via the support of Democrats. After the election, the members of the Keystone Battery held a celebration, where his win was hailed by one William Elliott Hill, Esquire, as a triumph of the people. In what would later be recognized as irony, Hill said he was sure that the Republicans of the 2nd District would never have occasion to be sorry for the selection they had made. Creeley, whose appearance was greeted with applause, only spoke briefly, thanking his supporters and saying that he was a radical Republican, always has been and always intended to be. The Radical Republicans were a faction and one generally in control of Congress in 1870. The name Radical had come before the war, owing for their support of an immediate end to slavery. In 1870, they favored harsher measures of Reconstruction, protection of civil rights for freedmen, and restrictions on former Confederates. But his politics would not become particularly clear in Congress. He was seated and appointed to the Committee on Indian Affairs. His vote was recorded in the Congressional Globe Index, the predecessor to the Congressional Record, on a ceremonial roll call at the beginning of the term. It was the only vote in that record by John V. Creeley during his tenure in Congress, although newspapers recorded occasional votes on various measures. His presence was not recorded at any of the proceedings of the Committee on Indian Affairs. He did not even collect his congressional pay from the Sergeant of Arms. Perhaps he was simply lazy. The Lancaster, Pennsylvania Daily Evening Express complained he was of the fungus breed of politician, found in the paradise of politicians whose ways are so particular. He loved the soft yellow sparkle of a diamond, and likewise the bright smile of a fair woman. He also sported a yacht, and in his elegant attire and genteel appearance was a model Philadelphia congressman. And the Vicksburg Herald wrote in 1872, Creeley came to Washington, studiously absented himself from his seat, and was a non-entity except with those government clerks and city police officers with whom he associated. But those descriptions might have been unfair, and his absence might not have been simply laziness. The Philadelphia Age reported in September of 1871 that Creeley, for several days past, has been lying seriously ill at his residence. Mr. Creeley was attacked with typhoid fever at Washington. The report implies that there was for a time concern that he might not even pull through, although the Age reported that he was much improved, and there is now a fair prospect of his recovery. But while Creeley was serving, O'Neill reconciled with Cameron. But Creeley was not giving in and decided to seek re-election on the ticket of Horace Greeley's anti-corruption liberal Republicans. The Chicago Tribune wrote in June of 1872, John V. Creeley, the Philadelphia Republican congressman who ran independently 2 years ago and defeated Charles O'Neill, will be the candidate for re-election on the Greeley ticket, the syndicate having nominated O'Neill. Creeley might have represented a threat to the Republicans, but then allegations arose of financial improprieties. The Westchester, Pennsylvania Jeffersonian reported on October 19, 1872, that Honorable John V. Creeley, congressman from the 2nd District, has succeeded in getting himself into a very sad predicament. It is alleged that a Mrs. Fearon of this city entrusted a number of bonds to Mr. Creeley for safekeeping, and that the member from the 2nd District used these bonds to pay his indebtedness to one Schultz, and has not up to this present time made any return to the lady, who relied upon his honor so far as to entrust her little fortune to his safekeeping. Had Congressman Creeley bilked a little old lady out of her life savings? A preliminary injunction was made, but it was not answered. In fact, the allegations were just the beginning. Creditors showed up claiming that he owed debts in excess of $20,000, more than $400,000 today. The creditors sought the back pay that it was owed by Congress, and it was that suit that brought to light something that the people of Pennsylvania's 2nd District had so far apparently failed to notice. Congressman John V. Creeley was nowhere to be found. He had not, in fact, been seen since July of 1872. The assumption was simple. He had absconded rather than face his debts. The Daily Evening Press reported, he was seized with a lounging desire to see in a sunnier clime that repose, which might someday be suddenly disturbed if he lingered amid the familiar scenes of home. And so between some somber twilight of evening and the early dawn of morning, he went to the bourne from which travelers who leave home suddenly at night scarcely ever return. And all last session there was a vacant chair. Creeley having gone absent, O'Neill was elected to the seat again in 1872. But where was Creeley? The 28-year-old congressman, lawyer, and militia officer had told his mother and friends that he was returning to Washington to attend to official duties and then was going to New Orleans with friends, and he was never heard from again. Bizarrely, his name showed up on a list of endorsements for a patent medicine years after he had gone missing. Nothing, in fact, was heard for a very long time. In June of 1900, 28 years after he went missing, his sister Adelaide sought to have John V. Creeley declared legally dead so that she should claim what little estate, his congressional back pay, was left. The Wichita Eagle wrote, for 28 years, this man, once prominent, with a good mother and sister and a comfortable home, has been lost to those who loved him. And the other day his sister, now a gray-haired woman, the mother is dead, appeared before Judge Hanna in the Orphans' Court and asked that her brother be declared dead so that she could collect money that was due to him by the United States government for his services in Congress. It was, the Wilkes-Barre Semi-Weekly Record opined, a remarkable case that most people, even in Philadelphia, have forgotten or long ago lost interest. And in the appeal, the nearly forgotten case seemed even more mysterious. It would have been assumed that he had simply absconded. If he did so, he was surprisingly thorough. It turns out that Elmida and Adelaide had made a surprisingly thorough effort to find their son and brother. Surprisingly, they had found that his personal effects had been left at the hotel in Washington, where he boarded when a member of the House. He had absconded, but left his suitcase behind? In what the Minneapolis Star-Tribune called a story of mother's love and a sister's devotion, the two had spent years searching. Believing that the son and brother was possibly in New Orleans, the mother and sister went there to look for him. Every part of the city was searched. They then went to other western and southern cities. Detectives were engaged, and failing to find him, members of the family again took up the search. England and the continent were visited. Inquiry was made at nearly every capital in Asia and Africa. Trip was made to South America and to the West Indies. The Philadelphia Times wrote that the slums of London and Paris, the towns of Russia, Germany, and all foreign countries were visited by the mother and sister. Cuba and Puerto Rico were searched. The mother and sister lived only to find the lost man. The Buffalo Courier opined, if not dead, Creeley has inflicted a world of suffering on his family by his failure to let his whereabouts be known. 28 years earlier, the assumption was that John Creeley had simply run away from his debts, but by 1900 the attitude was more sympathetic. The Wilkes-Barre Times leader wrote, "What cause, if one there was, for Creeley's disappearance no one appears to know. He was a man of some ability, and to all appearance had a fine public career opening to him." In 1927, 5 years after Adelaide's death, the Joint Committee on Printing prepared to reprint the Biographical Directory of the United States Congress. Ansel Wold, the committee clerk, had stories published across the nation in order to find out more about the missing congressman. No new leads were found, but he did receive letters from men who served with Creeley in the Union Army. One wrote, "He was a splendid soldier, with a fine record, and was honorably discharged at the end of his term of service. He went to Washington, and that was the last time that I, or any of his friends, ever heard of him. He never came back to Philadelphia, and disappeared utterly." The disappearance of John Vautrin Creeley is simply a mystery. If he absconded, he did so incredibly thoroughly. He left behind his yacht, his home, his practice, his seat in Congress, and even his toothbrush. Not to mention his family. He never seems to have contacted his mother or sister again. Had he simply determined to never be found, or did something more nefarious happen to this rebel politician who was being pursued by creditors? It seems unlikely that we'll ever find the answer, although I guess it's not impossible. If you happen to have inside information, leave a comment. But maybe what's most compelling about the whole story is the part that it has in common with the tens of thousands of people who go missing each year. Their families, left without answers, who never give up searching. Ambrose Bierce is without a doubt one of the most celebrated authors in American history. Perhaps most famous is his short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which famous author Kurt Vonnegut Jr. described as the greatest American short story of all time. But he was also a poet and a journalist, a writer of horror who is said to have inspired authors as diverse as H.P. Lovecraft and Ernest Hemingway. And that fame makes it all the more mysterious that in 1913, Ambrose Bierce disappeared without a trace. In his 1929 biography of his friend, Walter Neal said of Ambrose Bierce, "Bierce told me that he was born on a farm in Western Reserve in Ohio, and there remained until he was about 17, when he tired from farm life and ran away from his home to Chicago." As to his penchant for writing, Neal writes that Bierce's father was a man of considerable scholarship and had been private secretary to Franklin Pierce when that gentleman was president. It is indicative of Bierce, however, that Neal found out later that the story that Bierce had told him was not completely true. In fact, he had never run away, but had relocated with his family to Indiana until he enlisted during the Civil War. It is interesting that Bierce had both a penchant for telling stories, even to his good friends, as well as, apparently, dreams of running away, something that would turn out to be ironic. Bierce's family was certainly interesting. The Elkhart, Indiana Daily Truth recalled in 1922 that Marcus Aurelius Bierce and his wife had 12 children, twin sons who had died in infancy, and the following uniquely named sons and daughters who grew to maturity: Abigail, Addison, Emilius, Aurelius, Anne, Augustus, Andrew, Alameda, Albert, and Ambrose. While the paper reports that time and wars and the things that happened to families scattered the Bierces, only one of the 10 earned fame. For the youngest of the sons, Ambrose, one-time Elkhartian, wrote some short stories that are listed among American classics. But few now living in Elkhart even know that one of the nation's finest writers played as a boy in the muddy streets of the antebellum village. Oddly, given both his father's education and his future fame, Bierce apparently did not receive much in terms of formal education. A childhood friend recalled in the Daily Truth that the boy had what was called a poor chance. He quit school early and went to work in the brickyards. But Bierce would grow to maturity during a tumultuous time. The paper continues. Then Fort Sumter was fired on, and Elkhart was aflame with patriotism. Young fellows enlisted faster than they could be equipped and mobilized, and young Bierce was among the very first. He joined Company C, the 9th Indiana Infantry. Then he gave his friends their first surprise. The Army seemed to bring out in young Ambrose things that had never been seen in Elkhart. His education had been neglected, and he was always rather queer and different. But the first thing I knew, he was a commissioned officer on the staff of General W. E. Gross in the Army of Cumberland. As a topographical engineer, Bierce served throughout the war with great distinction. Bierce's experience in the war was clearly important. Perhaps his most famous piece, the short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is set during the war, as are many of his other stories. He served throughout the war in many of its bloodiest engagements, later writing a memoir of his experiences at the 1862 Battle of Shiloh. Enlisting as a private, by 1863 he had been promoted to first lieutenant and was a topographer working for Brigadier General William Hazen. Writing in a 1952 edition of the journal American Literature, Paul Fathout of Purdue University wondered how he acquired mastery in the craft of map-making is not clear, but he was apparently quite good at it, an indication of his intellect. He is frequently quoted as having said, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography," although the attribution is questioned. Hazen recommended him for an appointment to West Point, a recommendation that was supported by General Sherman, but a wound prevented him accepting. Recovered from his wounds, Fathout writes that his competence as acting topographical officer on the staff of Hazen so pleased his exacting commander that in 1866 he invited Bierce to be engineering attaché to the Hazen expedition to inspect military posts from Omaha to San Francisco. He left the military upon arriving in San Francisco with the rank of brevet major, quite impressive for a farm boy with little formal schooling. There, Bierce took on another career for which he had no apparent formal training, but great talent. The website of the American Poetry Foundation writes, a talented critic and satirist, his poems and other works were published in numerous newspaper columns for over 40 years, beginning with the Californian. In 1868, he became the editor of the Newsletter, for which he wrote his famous Town Crier column. Bierce became something of a noted figure in California literary society, forming friendships with Mark Twain, Bret Harte, and Joaquin Miller. He was a muckraking journalist, often published in William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner, The Poetry Foundation writes that for his sardonic wit and damning observations on the personalities and events of the day, he became known as the wickedest man in San Francisco. But he was also a poet, an essayist, and a writer of short stories, including works of horror. Bailey Millard, a noted historian who wrote a first-hand account of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, said of his works of horror, he wrote the most gruesome, the most harrowing, the most terrible tales ever published in this country. The Poetry Foundation writes that the classic Bierceum narrative includes a marked use of black humor, particularly in the ironic and hideous deaths his protagonists often suffer. Writing in England for the magazine Fun, his dark wit earned him the nickname Bitter Bierce. Noted is his 1906 Devil's Dictionary, which the Foundation describes as a lexicon of its author's wit and animosity, in which Bierce vented much of his contempt for politics, religion, society, and conventional human values. Among the definitions is politics, a strife of interests masquerading as a contest of principles, the conduct of public affairs for private advantage. Some may find that still relevant today. Or one of my favorites, for obvious reasons. History is an account, mostly false, of events, mostly unimportant, which were brought about by rulers, mostly knaves, and soldiers, mostly fools. It is no surprise that the Foundation notes that Bierce acquired the public persona of an admired but often hated genius, a man of contradiction and mystery. Writing on the website bookstellyouwhy.com, author Ben Keefe notes that Bierce was sarcastic, brutally tasteless, and very good at not making friends. Keefe remarks, public opinion surrounding the man can be summed up in one fact. He carried a gun to ward off detractors. Still, the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration ranked the Devil's Dictionary among the 100 greatest masterpieces of American literature. Keefe writes that he was also a fantastic wordsmith. Millard notes that technically none could touch him. He corrected Kipling and even Howells. And in his critical essays, he showed where many other famous authors failed in their facts or in their diction. Such work made him a target for satire himself, with satirist Arthur McEwen posting that his initials A.G. Bierce stood for Almighty God Bierce. In 1914, Millard summed up his career. Bierce led a most remarkable life, half hermit, half bohemian, and altogether egotistical and cynical. In the West, he was the most hated and feared of writers, and the most courted and spoiled. He lampooned nearly everybody in political and private life with hair-raising audacity. As dean of the Pacific Coast Letter, he made and unmade authors and poets. The dilettante worshipped him. He has been called the American Swift, the last of the satirists, and the Maupassant of the West. He was an iconoclast of the first order. Millard, who wrote I Knew the Man Well, was writing in December of 1914, approximately a year since anyone had heard from Ambrose Bierce. The Oakland Tribune reported in October 1914. To give the full history of the strange disappearance of Bierce, it is first necessary to go back to his 71st birthday, which he celebrated with friends in Washington, D.C. last October. Shortly afterwards, he left Washington to make a tour of the southern battlefields where he had seen service as an engineer. In 1913 was commemorated the 50th anniversary of Chickamauga and other battles in which Major Bierce had taken part, and it was that fact which prompted him to make the tour. He did not intend to return to his home in Washington. In his characteristic fashion, he told friends that this damn country was not fit to live in, with prohibition and women voting. Instead, he said, he wanted to see a scrap before he died. His announced plan was to cross the border into Mexico. Mexico at the time was in the midst of civil war. Millard writes that when Villa rose against Huerta and the Constitutionalists, Bierce, who was a northern captain in the Civil War and was a brevet major for exceptional gallantry, went to Mexico and joined the staff of the doughty general. It appears that Bierce had finally done what he claimed to have done at age 17 and run away from home. The Tribune writes that his plan was to make his way to the west coast, sail thence for the west coast of South America, cross the Andes to the east coast of South America, and then return home. The Tribune reports the last letter received from him reached the United States around the December holidays. It had been written in Chihuahua and had been delayed in transmission. In that last letter from Chihuahua, Bierce stated that he was in the saddle and on the move. If you don't hear from me for some time, don't be alarmed, is the substance of one sentence this letter contained. So there was no alarm felt for some little time, but when a month, 2 months, 3 months passed, and there came no word from him, his friends became greatly alarmed. Since that time there has been no word of Bierce. He vanished as completely as though the earth had swallowed him up. By 1914, his friends were certain of his death. The Tribune writes that those who knew Bierce best say that he would never have stayed in Mexico once he received news of the Great War in Europe. It was to see fighting that he went to Mexico, but his friends declared that he would never waste his time on the Mexican Revolution, when the most tremendous conflict of history waged in another theater. Millard wrote that his friends, united in saying that if he were alive, he would not have left them so long in suspense. There is so little doubt of his death that his friends and relatives have given up searching for him and mourn him as lost. Ironically, Bierce had included 3 stories under the heading Mysterious Disappearances in his 1893 collection of horror tales called Can Such Things Be? Like Bierce, the 3 protagonists disappear without a trace. Author Joe Nickell wrote in 1992, Bierce's own unsolved disappearance seems an altogether fitting end for a writer who was fascinated by mysterious disappearances. Exactly what happened to the famous author is still a mystery. The Anderson, Indiana Herald reported in September 1914 that an official inquiry into the disappearance in Mexico had been made by the Departments of State and War at the request of the Secretary of the Interior, but, quote, nothing has been heard. Many theories have arisen. In 1934, the Evansville, Indiana Journal reported that a soldier of fortune named Tex O'Reilly had fought in the war in Mexico and was familiar with the circumstances of Bierce's death, saying that Bierce had fallen in with bandits in a drinking bout. They became suspicious, lured him to a lonely spot, and pistoled him with his own 6-shooter. A retired priest named Jamie Linehart became so convinced of a story that Bierce had been executed by Villaists that he had a gravestone erected in the town of Sierra Mojada. Neal discounts these stories, as does Joe Nickell in his 1992 book Ambrose Bierce is Missing. Both authors note that a physical copy of the often reported letter from Chihuahua has never been located, and there's reason to suspect that it never existed. There is no compelling evidence that Bierce even entered Mexico. Nickell writes that the numerous stories that have risen since are merely speculation. The perpetual stories of Mexicans who remember the quarrel between Villa and Bierce or Bierce's burial on the battlefield invariably peter out into uncertainties once investigated. If the number keeps increasing, as many Mexican towns will claim to have been the death place of Bierce, as Grecian towns claim to be the birthplace of Homer. In a 2002 edition of Harper's Magazine, author Jacob Silverstein notes a 1990 letter to the editor to the Marfa, Texas Sentinel, claiming that Bierce had died in Marfa on January 17, 1914. The story came via a Marfa resident who had picked up an old hitchhiker in 1957 who claimed that he had fought in the Mexican Civil War. He told the driver that they'd encountered an old man, quite sick from a cold, and escorted him to Texas, where U.S. troops confused him for a fleeing deserter from Mexico. He was taken to a camp where he died of pneumonia and was buried in a common grave. Silverstein was, however, unable to locate the cemetery where the body was supposed to have been buried. In April of 1915, the New York World reported the shocking news that Bierce had been found in France. The paper reported that a letter had been received by his daughter, and that Bierce had left Mexico, traveled to France, and was on the staff of Lord Kitchener. His standing claim was never verified, and Nickell notes that Bierce's daughter denied ever having received such a letter. As for Nickell and Neal, both concluded that Bierce likely committed suicide. Neal compiles numerous sources as to Bierce's state of mind and concluded that he simply did not want to deal with the infirmity of age. Neal speculates that the trip to Mexico was simple misdirection and that Bierce most likely killed himself at a spot in Arizona's Grand Canyon. Millard, however, also a personal friend of Bierce, disagrees. I knew the man well. He was a fatalist and did not believe in assisting fate. Of course, there's one further possibility. In the 1922 article in the Elkhorn newspaper, a childhood friend is quoted as saying, I wouldn't be surprised if he was still alive. Brose was that sort of chap. You never knew what he was going to do. He did so many things that surprised us that it wouldn't marvel much if he showed up someday. In Bierce's 1893 short story, Charles Ashmore's Trail, a young man is sent to fetch a pail of water, and when he doesn't return, his family goes to search for him. They find his tracks in the snow, but they simply mysteriously stop. The morning light showed nothing more. Smooth, spotless, absolutely unbroken. The shallow snow lay everywhere. Ambrose Bierce's trail seems to be much the same. On October 16, 1972, a Cessna 310 twin-engine light aircraft went missing en route between Anchorage and Juneau, Alaska. That in itself isn't too surprising. Flying in Alaska is notoriously treacherous, but this particular accident was notable in that 2 U.S. congressmen were on board. Nick Begich, Alaska's only congressman, and Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the House Majority Leader. And to this day, no sign of the wreckage has ever been found. And in the 5 decades since, the mystery of what happened has only deepened. The loss of Pan Alaska Airways Cessna 310C deserves to be remembered. Just before 9 a.m. on October 16, 1972, a twin-engine Cessna 310C, operated by a small charter service called Pan Alaska Airways, registration number N1812H, took off from Anchorage International Airport, bound for the state's capital, Juneau. On board were 2 U.S. congressmen. 40-year-old Democrat Nick Begich was Alaska's only House representative. He was in his first term, having been elected in 1970. The former school superintendent had previously served 8 years in the Alaska State Senate. While the Fairbanks Daily News described him as an immensely popular first-term congressman, both at home and in the U.S. House of Representatives, Politico explained in 2016 that at the time, Begich, a freshman, was locked in a tight race against Republican Don Young. That tight race was the reason that a second congressman was also on board, Louisiana Congressman Hale Boggs. Boggs, father of longtime ABC News correspondent Cokie Roberts, had first been elected to Congress in 1940. At the age of 27, he was, at the time, the youngest member of Congress. He had lost the nomination in 1941 and enlisted in the Navy, ran again successfully in 1946 after the war, and had served for the next 26 years. He was a House Majority Whip between 1962 and 1971 before becoming the Majority Leader in January of 1971. He had traveled to Alaska to assist Begich's re-election bid. The congressman, along with one of Begich's aides, Russell Brown, were on their way to a campaign fundraiser. The pilot of the 4-seat twin-engine Cessna was 38-year-old Don Johns. Writing in an August 2022 edition of the magazine Plane and Pilot, experienced pilot Isabel Goyer said of Johns, "The pilot, himself a remarkable character, went by the name Don Johns, though that wasn't his original name." Johns, who was 38, had changed his name earlier in his life to distinguish himself from the many thousands of other Don Joneses in the world. Johns owned not only the Cessna twin that he was flying, but also the small charter company, which he had grandly called Pan Alaska Airways. A National Transportation Safety Board report described Johns as an experienced pilot with a valid air transport certificate. He had logged 17,000 hours of flight time, with 11,900 hours of cross-country time and 10,065 hours of multi-engine time. According to the NTSB, Johns had successfully passed an instrument flight check just 6 days earlier. The Cessna 310 was a C model, built in 1959. The Cessna 310 had gained popularity as the plane used in the popular 1950s TV series Sky King. It has generally been described as sturdy and comfortable, and the vintage model is still popular among aviation enthusiasts. The airplane in Alaska was an early model and so had the distinctive straight tail, and according to the NTSB, had a total time of service of 3,177 hours. The report noted that the plane had had a 100-hour inspection on October 15th that had found no outstanding discrepancies. Goyer noted that the plane seemed fine. The evening before, the pilot had flown the light twin-engine Cessna down from Fairbanks just for this flight. Fresh out of its regular 100-hour maintenance check and fully fueled up again in Anchorage for the chartered flight, the 1959 Cessna 310C was in game shape for the planned 575-mile jaunt down to Juneau. The NTSB reported that the plane had enough fuel for 6 hours, plenty enough for the anticipated 3.5-hour flight, and that the employee who had filled the plane saw and heard the aircraft and stated that it appeared and sounded normal. The NTSB reported that at about 9:09, the pilot of November 1812 Hulu established radio communication with the Anchorage FFS, or Flight Service Station. The pilot filed his Visual Flight Rules, or VFR plan. The report states that in response to the specialist's query as to whether he had emergency gear and a locator beacon on board, the pilot replied, "Affirmative." The FSS specialist then advised the pilot of the current weather reports. The report states, "This was the last known communication with the occupants of N1812H. Plane and pilot notes that, fittingly perhaps, the recording of that radio call also has been lost." At 1:15, the U.S. Coast Guard reported the plane overdue, and the Air Force diverted an 8C-130 aircraft to commence a search. The NTSB report noted that this effort began one of the most extensive searches for a missing aircraft that has been conducted in recent aviation history. Politico reports that it involved 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, a search grid of 325,000 square miles, and more than 3,600 hours of search time. The Washington Post reported in 2019, over the next 39 days, the Boggs family got regular briefings and photos from spy planes based at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage. Hunters, boats, and more than 70 airplanes joined in the search, which was the largest in Alaska's history at the time. They found another plane that had been missing for 17 years, but they never recovered the congressman's aircraft. Plane and pilot writes that the NTSB, in its report on January 31, 1973, concluded that it didn't have enough evidence to say what caused the disappearance. Not much has changed since then in that regard. The report is still the final word. The Washington Post writes that when the phone rang a few hours later at the Begich household in McLean, Virginia, Alaska Governor Bill Egan was on the line. Begich's wife, Peggy, immediately knew something was wrong. "I just had an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach." The disappearance, so close to the election, created a specific problem. Both Boggs and Begich were already on the ballot, and both still might be found. Begich's opponent, Don Young, temporarily suspended his campaign, although he later again began quietly campaigning. The Fairbanks Daily News listed possible scenarios, including that Begich be re-elected and found alive, be re-elected and found dead after the election, and, most confusingly, that Begich be re-elected and never found, which was, in fact, the case. This, the paper reported, would cause the most difficulty for the state. That eventuality would require a family member to petition to have the congressman declared dead. As it happened, both Begich and Boggs won re-election, despite being missing. They are two of the 5 people to have been elected to the U.S. House or Senate after their deaths in U.S. history. After the failure of the search, both were finally declared dead in absentia on December 29th. Special elections were held. Begich's seat was won in the special election by his Republican challenger, and Boggs was replaced by his wife, Lindy. That itself required a stroke of fortune, as there had been talk of the wives accompanying the men on their trip. She told the Post, "We'd both considered it, but she and Lindy Boggs decided that there were just too many responsibilities to attend to in Washington." But the political situation gave rise to conspiracy theories as well. Boggs had famously been both part of the Warren Commission and had disagreed with its conclusions, especially that of the magic bullet that pointed to a single shooter. The mysterious accident is usually included in the list of mysterious deaths that suggest a conspiracy regarding the JFK assassination. And in 2021, journalist John Walczak reported in his podcast Missing in Alaska that not only were there discrepancies in the NTSB report, but that a jailhouse confession in 1994 indicated that the plane had been destroyed by a bomb planted by the mob, but targeting Begich, not Boggs. Goyer writes that without hearing the details, and there are details galore, it sounds like the stuff of tin hats and YouTube rants. But it's supported by a good deal of real evidence, much of it unearthed by journalist John Walczak over the past 7 years and presented in a compelling iHeartRadio podcast called Missing in Alaska. Once you hear the evidence, you'll have a hard time dismissing the theory out of hand. But Boggs' grandson, Stephen Sigmund, was less impressed, writing Walczak's premise for the podcast, a 1994 jailhouse claim by a convicted murderer named Jerry Paisley, who was briefly married to Begich's widow, that the plane was intentionally targeted by mobsters with a bomb, while attention-grabbing, leaves an enormous number of holes. Moreover, it has never been corroborated by anyone else. Goyer, however, offers this perspective. How likely is it that the plane was taken out of the sky by a bomb? Given the tentative evidence turned up by the FBI and subsequent researchers, chiefly Walczak, it's impossible to say, but until some far more convincing evidence emerges, the more likely explanation is the simplest one, that the plane crashed after encountering bad weather. The pilot had filed a Visual Flight Rules plan. Visual Flight Rules, or VFR, is intended for conditions in which the weather is generally clear enough that the pilot can see where they are going. Importantly, Pan Alaska Airways certification was under Part 135 of Federal Aviation Regulations, and under the 135 rules, the service was restricted to VFR flight unless there were 2 pilots on board. But that day, the NTSB explains, the weather conditions along the proposed route to Juneau were not conducive to flight under Visual Flight Rules. Goyer writes that the plane took off under gray skies and into what was, at best, marginal flying weather. As the blog, interestingly titled The Awful Awesomeness of Life, explains, if commercial pilots refused to fly in marginal weather, though, they would not make money, because the weather is often bad in Alaska. Flying in Alaska can certainly be dangerous. The website Alaska Web writes that the Pilots Association Air Safety Foundation data shows that Alaska's accident rate for smaller general aviation aircraft was more than 2 times higher than the national average. The San Diego Union-Tribune wrote in 2010, more than 80% of Alaska's communities, including the state capital of Juneau, are not connected to highways or road systems, making travel by air or water an essential. The state says Alaska has roughly 1 registered pilot for every 58 residents, and its plane crash rate is much higher than the national average. Alaska Web writes that for many Alaskans, flying hundreds of miles to larger cities for shopping and errands is as common as taxis and buses might be to urban dwellers. And the Union Tribune noted that former U.S. Senator Ted Stevens was so mindful of the risks that he once called plane crashes an occupational hazard for politicians in Alaska. And he spoke from experience. He survived a plane crash in 1978 that killed his wife. That comment included an additional irony. Stevens was killed in a small plane crash in the state in 2010. Again, without the wreckage, it's difficult to determine. Goyer notes that what role the weather played in the loss of N1812H, however, will likely remain a mystery. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the plane crashed in bad weather, as many hundreds of other planes have crashed over the years in Alaska. Though again, there is no direct evidence to support that theory either. And why was the plane not found? The pilot had claimed that there was an emergency locator on board, but as of October 17th, the NTSB told the Associated Press, "So far we haven't heard a squawk out of it." In fact, the NTSB eventually concluded that no locator was on board. The report indicated that a witness had seen an object in the pilot's briefcase that was approximately the size and shape of an ELT, but also noted that the chief pilot's personal ELT was found, after N1812H was reported missing, in the cabin of another Pan-Alaska aircraft at Fairbanks. Plane and pilot speculates that it's likely, though far from certain, that when Johns headed out from Fairbanks the day before the fateful flight, he simply forgot to grab the portable unit from the other airplane and didn't realize it until he was already on his way to Anchorage, or already there. And when he was asked if he had an ELT on board, he did what many pilots would have done in that same circumstance, and fibbed. Despite the lack of locator, however, why was the plane not found in the extensive search? Goyer explains that, where did it wind up that it hasn't been found all these years later? The possibilities are endless. Perhaps it crashed into Prince William Sound, sinking into the depths, never to be seen again, or maybe it slammed into a glacier where it was buried in snow and ice. Perhaps it crashed into the side of a mountain and slid down into a steep ravine or high forested section of steep rock. There are so many other scenarios that could have played out to hide the wreckage from history, which makes it no different than many other crashes in Alaskan aviation history in which a plane never showed up somewhere and, despite heroic efforts to find it, was never seen again. And of course, there's still the chance that the wreckage might be found. While he discounted the bomb theory, Boggs' grandson hoped that the work that was done by Walsek might help to narrow down the location of the wreck, and if it could be found, it might finally help to solve a mystery more than 5 decades old. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.